I'm here with Todd Goddard. Thanks so much, Todd, for joining me on Walking Inside Poems.
Thank you so much for having me, John. I'm delighted.
I am too. I'm looking forward to talking about one of my absolute favorites, Jim Harrison. And I know you have a biography of Jim coming out this year. Is that right?
I do, yeah. Devouring Time, Jim Harrison, A Writer's Life, which is due out November 4th, 2025.
Mm. I was hoping you could give me an earlier date. I'm eagerly awaiting that book, and uh, yeah, it's one that it will go straight to the top of my reading list when it comes out. How long have you been working on this project?
It's been 5 or 6 years, probably more like six, just through the design and editing process and everything else. It's shaping up to be a 6 year project. Had COVID in between, and so that threw some wrenches into the gears. The archives were closed, and people were hard to access. But yeah, it's been a long journey, very fulfilling and fruitful one.
How did you come?
I'm gonna miss it, but at the same time, I'm sort of happy.
Yeah, yeah,
You know,
I understand that for sure.
to see it
Uh,
come together, right?
yeah, and what led to you writing this book?
I grew up reading Jim Harrison, and was always sort of in love with his poetry. It affected me, his fiction, and I had a chance in graduate school to teach some of his books, and continued that when I moved on from graduate school and got employed at a university. And I had read somewhere in a newspaper that his papers had been collected by Grand Valley State University outside of Grand Rapids many years ago, and I thought at the time, wow, that would be a great biography to write. I was excited about biography. I'd studied under biographers as an undergrad, and sort of had my eye on writing one when the right sort of subject and time came along. And so I sort of dismissed it. I said, well, someone must be doing that, and I let it sit for a few years. And then when I sort of got serious about undertaking one, I reached out to his family and told them who I was and what I wanted to do and why. And things sort of had their own momentum from there on out. The family was incredibly receptive and helpful and gracious, and that was the beginning. We're
Yeah,
off and running.
that is fantastic. Well, sure, looking forward to that book. So you teach at Utah Valley University, is that right?
I do, yeah. I've been there for about 10 years. Went there right after graduate school at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I've been there ever since. I teach an English department.
You
Uh,
also, though, have a JD, is that right?
I do have a JD. Yeah. I went,
That's
you know,
fascinating.
our paths are rarely linear. There's a lot of zigzagging in my career. And yeah, I went to University of Connecticut School of Law many years ago. And I just found myself throughout law school thinking about books and wandering into bookstores. And pretty much right after I graduated, I went back to graduate school.
We have sort of similar paths. I have advanced degrees in business and in English, and have taught at the university level, both in English and in the business school. So I understand. Well, so you chose Counting Birds, and I was glad to see you did. I guess maybe just as a way into that, what of the many possible books or poems that you could have chosen, how did you choose Counting Birds, or
It's one
why?
of my personal, I think it's one of my personal favorites. I find it incredibly moving poem. Um, Comes from a wonderful collection, The Theory and Practice of Rivers, which I adore. Um, Came about mid-career for him, or at least mid-career in the midst of his books of poetry. Um, he was approaching 50 when he wrote The Theory and Practice of Rivers. And there were some close contenders out there. How do you choose one Jim Harrison poem? I think we had communicated at one point, and it's not easy. And so I really do. I watched recently your episode with Joseph Bednarik, and I'm really hoping you have him on the show to do the complete poems of Copper Canyon.
Yeah, yeah, we'll definitely do that for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how many we can talk about in 30 or 40 minutes, but we'll do our
No.
best.
Right.
Yeah, it's a great poem for sure. And normally, as I mentioned this to you in an email, normally I read the poem at the beginning here, and then I asked my guest to read it, taking out. We're going to try something different. You were recently, I don't know how recently, you were involved in I guess it was a fundraiser for Copper Canyon.
That's right.
And there's a YouTube, and in that YouTube, there's Jim reading this poem. So why don't we just jump to that right now?
Fantastic.
Hopefully this volume will be good.
Counting birds. This is for Anishinaabe, or a Native American Chippewa poet I like a lot, Gerald Bisner. Counting birds. As a child, fresh out of the hospital with tape covering the left side of my face, I began to count birds. At age 50, the sum total is precise and astonishing, my only secret. Some men count women or the cars they've owned, their shirts, long sleeved, short sleeved, their shoes. But I have my birds, excluding, of course, those extraordinary days, the 21,000 snow geese and sandhill cranes at Bosque del Apache, the sky blinded by great frigate birds in the Pacific off Anconcito, Ecuador, the 21,000 pink flamingos at Ngorongoro Crater in Tanzania, the vast flocks of seabirds on the Seri coast of the Sea of Cortez down in Sonora that left at nightfall, then reappeared, resuming their exact positions at dawn, the 1,000 cliff swallows nesting in the sand cliffs of Pyramid Point, their small round burrows like eyes, really the souls of the Anasazi who flew here 1,000 years ago to await the coming of the Manitou. And then there were the usual almost deadly birds of the soul. The crow was so harnessed I rode one night as if she were a black-feathered angel. The birds I became to escape unfortunate circumstances. How the skin ached as the feathers shot out toward light. The 1,000 birds the dog helped me shoot to become a bird. Grouse, woodcock, duck, dove, snipe, pheasant, prairie chicken. On my deathbed, I'll write the secret number at a slip and pass to my wife and 2 daughters. It will be a hot evening in late June, and they might be glancing out the window as the thunderstorms approach from the west. Looking past their eyes and a dead fly on the window screen, I'll wonder if there's a bird waiting for me in the sun-rushing clouds. Oh, birds, I'll sing to myself. You carried me along on this bloody voyage. Carry me now into that cloud, into the marvel of this final night.
Whoa. So good, man. So good. He wrote a lot about birds, didn't he?
Oh yeah. I mean, you could practically just open, the complete poems and pick out a poem, and you're likely to catch a bird in the poem, right?
Yeah. Maybe before we get into this poem a little bit more, let's just talk about Jim for a few minutes. Did you have an opportunity to spend any time with him?
I never got to meet Jim, which is a sort of a peculiar phenomenon, right, for a biographer. Someone who I never personally met, even though I've spoken to countless people who were very close to him and knew him in all sorts of different ways, and to know him so well as in one way, right? I know him, in myriad ways, but I don't have that personal connection to him with it, which I think is a curse and a blessing for a biographer. Maybe
Sure.
More of a blessing.
I never got to meet the man or see him in person. The closest I came, I got to spend some time with his friend Doug Peacock, and so I almost feel like I have that connection with him. But one of the things that I'm curious about is he did win some awards. He did get some recognition, but there's no Pulitzer, no National Book Award. Why? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's a question that haunted Jim, frankly. I think in some ways, and rightly so, there's an image of Jim out there as being not concerned with sort of formal recognition. And I think there was a strong part of him that felt that way, but I think there was another part of him that felt certainly under-recognized and at times bitter about it throughout his life. At different moments in his life, he often felt his books weren't getting enough recognition, or misunderstood. And I think there are a lot of reasons why he didn't win those top prizes. I certainly think it wasn't because he wasn't deserving. I think he certainly was deserving. But I think, part of it has to do with him being a novelist, and part of it has to do with him being a screenwriter. And unfairly, I think people didn't know how to categorize him, right? And they didn't know what he was doing. They thought he'd sort of left poetry at one point. I think a reviewer mentions at one point that Jim Harrison's name doesn't come up often in the world of poetry, which seems remarkable, right? Given his prodigious output. So I think it has to do with something, it has to do with that. It has to do with the fact that he wasn't a professional poet. He didn't go out and sort of do the poetry circuits. And, although poetry was his first love, right? He called it the true bones of his life. And I think he deeply felt that far above and beyond anything else that he wrote or worked on, poetry was his number one love. But he didn't want to participate in some of the professional exercises that poets do to gain recognition. And to build his reputation as a poet, build the kind of connections and things that might have brought him the prizes. I think he lived a long way from New York. He said at one point, a lot of literary success comes from social contiguity. It comes from being close to people, right? And living, which often meant living around New York City, right? Or on the dream coast, as Jim called them. And he didn't do that. And I think his poetry itself is sort of, he wasn't dogmatic about poetry, and so he didn't belong to a school per se, right? He didn't, he sort of marked out that territory very early on in his life. He wasn't going to be labeled and categorized and sort of follow the orthodoxy of a particular school of poetry. And so I think all of those reasons sort of converge, right? That unfortunately sort of excluded him from some of the big prizes and some of the recognition he deserved.
Absolutely deserved. And he was incredibly prolific. I mean, my God, the novellas, the screenplays, the poems, the essays, the novels, it just goes on and on and on. One of my absolute favorites is this book of essays here. And that introduction by Luis Alberto Urrea. Wow. It says so much about Jim for sure. Well, let's look at this poem a little bit and see what we can discover here or glean from it. I mean, just the title itself is wonderful, Counting Birds. I know a lot of people probably do count birds. I've never been a bird counter, but I've been one I've really really connected to birds. My mother and I had a very strong connection. I spent some years high school years living in Northern Virginia. And we sort of had a forest behind our house, and my mother and I used to sit on the back porch and watch birds and look them up in bird books. And ever since then, I've had just a really sort of strong connection to birds. So I'm going to like this poem right off the bat with the title like Counting Birds for sure. And he makes reference right away of and he does this over and over again, doesn't he, about the accident that happened when he was a child that took one of his eyes?
Yes. I mean, yeah, you can't diminish that in importance, right? For shaping his life and his view of the world.
In the biography, do you tell the story of that? Because I've never heard much about it.
Yeah, so Jim was he was just a boy. He was maybe 7 years old, living in Reed City, Michigan. In the northern part of the state, and he had wandered down to a hospital yard down the street from his parents' house and was there with a young girl, probably around his age. And as he would describe it later, and many times throughout the years, he described it as sort of they were playing doctor, right? There was something going on. I've never heard it described in complete detail, but we can imagine what might have been going on. But apparently the girl panicked and or got frustrated or angry or upset or something, and took a glass beaker that was out in a sort of near a trash pile behind the hospital and wedged it into his eye in sort of one short, sharp shock to the eye. And in that quick second, Jim's life completely changed, right? Literally was halved, right? And incredibly traumatic event for him, something it took him many years, to come to terms with, if he ever did fully. But I think he also attributed that partly to his sort of perspective as a writer, right? Being sort of off to the side, right? And so I think it both sort of traumatized him. Exactly.
Side, yes.
Yeah, the name of Jim's memoir, right? And so both traumatized him, but also, gave him a different way of seeing, literally and figuratively.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. This is maybe a silly question, but he says that he has a precise sum total, and I thought maybe one of the reasons you chose this poem, even though it was kind of mid-career, is that it can almost be seen as an elegy for him, because it talks about his death. And he says he's going to pass that number on to his wife and his daughters. I guess his wife was not alive at the time. Did he pass? Is it too silly of me to think it was literal? Did he pass some number on to his daughters?
Not that I've ever heard of. I don't think he did, actually. No one was by Jim's deathbed. He died writing a poem at his desk in Patagonia, Arizona. Very fitting, right, in many ways. But yeah, he did not pass. He passed the poem on to those who found him and on to his family, but not the secret number.
Yeah, it will remain secret. And this poem, just kind of riffing on a little bit, one of the things it does, it mentions a lot of places around the world. I know he was very well traveled, wrote a lot for magazines and whatnot. I wonder, did that have a negative impact on the powers that be with respect to those awards? The fact that he wrote for popular magazines quite a bit, was kind of known as hanging out with Jack Nicholson a little bit, kind of, even though he was anything but a Hollywood type. But did that have, do you think, a negative effect on him?
I think it did. Yeah, I think it contributed to his, the feeling that Jim had somehow moved on from poetry in some way, right, and was doing other things unfairly. But I think that was the perception to some extent. But it was that very same journalism that simultaneously brought him a very large readership, right? I think I was having a conversation with Joseph Bednarik one day, and we were talking about sort of Jim's trajectory as a poet, and as Joseph said, he said that he would collect this huge sort of following of people through his food writing and through his essay writing, and probably certainly through his novels. And then they would come to the poetry, right? They'd get curious about Jim and they'd follow him out, and then they'd find his poetry, but they didn't come to the poetry first. And so it had a really weird effect, right? On the one hand, it sort of alienated him, if you want to use that word. Even Jim says that's an overused word, that's lost its meaning from overuse, but it simultaneously brought him a tremendous sort of onrush of readers, right? And bolstered his reputation. So
I would even dare say a lot of people, I don't know how many, but a lot of people have come to him through the film
Legends
of the Fall. Yeah, that's right. So he was probably first known as maybe a screenwriter.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, that brought him a sort of national attention that he didn't have even necessarily, right? He had a smaller readership from his magazines, but he was building a readership, right? And a sort of following of people who were really attracted to his voice and his charisma and his lifestyle. But still, at the end of the day, you can ask, 9 out of 10 people who know Jim Harrison know Legends, right? They're going to say, oh, I know Legends, right? Oh, that's Jim Harrison. It's still Legends that really, yeah.
We're not really talking about the poem much, but that's okay. I'm so interested in just the man himself, and maybe
Of
we can get back
course.
to the poem in a minute. But Who were his heroes? Who did he really look up to and hold in high esteem and maybe influenced him?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, there's so many. Jim loved a lot of writers. I mean, you have Whitman and Rimbaud, right? You have the Romantic poets, Keats especially, which he says he said Keats sort of, when he was early on, and Jim was very sort of enthusiastic about religion, he sort of said Keats was one of the people who sort of brought him over from religion to art, and art really became a sort of religion for him, right? And sort of displaced um, religion for him, formal religion anyway, right?
Yeah.
In that way. Um, Gary Snyder, right? Huge influence. He did that wonderful movie documentary with him, The Practice of Wild, and Denise Levertov, Denise Levertov and the Black Mountain poets, Robert Duncan and Creeley and Olson, and all those people were very influential for Jim, right? Jim deeply admired Levertov and Duncan, and Levertov was a mentor to Jim very early on, was the first poet really to get him published. She got him published. She was poetry editor at Norton and got his first collection of poetry, Plainsong, published. And so Rilke, Rene Char, Yesenin, the Russians, Mayakovsky. I think those were some of his heroes. I'm sure I'm leaving out a bunch because he had so many.
What did he think of Hemingway? Because I mean, you look at the man himself, and it's hard not to make that comparison. What do you think of Hemingway?
Yeah, I mean, he had so much in common with Hemingway, right? In so many ways, the comparison was so easily made, right? He's a hunter fisher from northern Michigan, right? All of these things that he had, he was imbibed deeply.
Journalist as well.
He was a journalist as well, and I think like all the writers of Hemingway's sort of the post-Hemingway generation, I think all writers, including Harrison, sought to distance themselves from Hemingway, right? Because they didn't want to be enveloped by him. And so I think Jim took a lot of opportunities to distance himself from him, but I think he liked Hemingway. I think he admired Hemingway. He says as much on a number of occasions, right? He wrote essays on Hemingway. He says he wrote about war as well as anyone ever has. And so I think there's a knee-jerk reaction to say that Jim didn't really care for Hemingway or his style and had other, influences. And I think that's very fair. I don't think he's a Hemingway-esque writer per se, but I think Jim deeply admired Hemingway and sort of went in a different direction, maybe just specifically to distance himself from him and the shadow he cast, right?
Yeah. Todd, what do you want to say about this poem?
It's a perplexing little poem. This was written at a time when Jim was always interested in Native American history, right? And culture, and I use that just term very generally right now, but he more than anyone studied out very specific tribes and learned their cultures and things. But at this time he was writing a screenplay just before he wrote this collection, Theory and Practice, and he was writing a screenplay on the ethnographer Edward Curtis, who had taken so many photos of Native Americans, right? Yep. And he was just in a run-up to boot for researching Dalva, okay? And so that history was very much on his mind, right? The violence of that history, right? The pain, he said it was incredibly depressive and painful to research both Curtis's books, screenplay and Dalva. And I think so was very much on his mind at this point when he was writing, say, Counting Birds. And so I think he's, it's sort of structured around that, it seems to me, right? It's structured around, if we take a look at the poem here.
Let's do. Help me understand what you mean by it's structured around that.
Well, let's see. He talks about the birds, but then when he gets to sort of, he says and this is about mid-poem. He says let's actually back up for a second. We can just kind of go over the poem, not line by line. I don't want to direct this, so feel free to take charge. But he introduces the poem that he started counting birds, and then he says, well, excluding these extraordinary days, right? And I think he's accounting for his life, right? And here, in a way, counting birds is a way of accounting for his life, right? But in a way that isn't measured by other things, like time itself, for instance, or dates, which he said at one point, I don't really pay much attention to what does he say? The mundanity of dates or something like that, right?
In fact, at one point he said he measures his life by his dogs.
Measures his life by his dogs, right?
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah, he says, I ignore the banality of dates.
yeah,
He says at one point, right? Um, and so what's taking its place, in my opinion, in this poem is these experiences, right? These moments of birds. There's an accounting of birds specifically, but there's an accounting of experiences. And the birds sort of are in the center of those experiences. You know, he traveled to Ecuador, he traveled to the Ngorongoro crater, you know, he went to all these places and
right.
had these experiences. And then he comes back to Pyramid Point, right, which is just outside of his house, not too far from his house, right, in Lake Leelanau in Michigan. Um, and and all of a sudden, right, where he says, you know, in the sand cliffs of Pyramid Point, there's small round burrows like eyes, really the souls of the Anasazi who flew here 1,000 years ago to wait the coming of the Manitou. And so,
So good.
striking image, right?
Yeah.
And he's inviting that history into us, right? In Native American history, right? The Anasazi, right? I'm no expert in Anasazi history, certainly, but their sort of disappearance from their sort of precarious rock cliff dwellings in Four Corners is still a matter of debate and speculation. And so he sort of mythologizes here, right? And imagines them sort of migrating as cliff swallows, the pyramid.
Turning
point,
into
right?
birds. Turning into
Yeah,
birds.
turning.
They disappeared. They just turned into birds and flew away.
Right,
Yeah.
they turn into birds. Their souls sort of morph and sort of migrate to Pyramid Point, this place not far from his house, in a place called Sleeping Bear Dunes National Monument, which itself has a really interesting story behind it. And await the coming of the Manitou, you know, some kind of great spirit, right, that happened to have named these islands just off Pyramid Point in Lake Michigan. There's North and South Manitou Island, right?
And then Jim turns into a bird himself.
And then Jim has this dream, right, or this vision, or this experience, right, where he morphs into a bird himself, right, not unlike the Anasazi.
Right. That is, I think, my favorite moment of the poem, where he says, "The crow with silver harness I rode one night as if she were a black feathered angel."
Yeah.
You know, it's just so good. It sounds so easy when it's on the page here. It's just, oh, that's cool, but brilliant, just brilliant.
And Jim was really interested in visions and having these sorts of experiences, and they often involved transformations that involved animals, right? He writes as much. You know, the movie Wolf, which he wrote the screenplay, is about, right, a werewolf, but a human transformation. He's very interested in these kind of transformative moments, right?
He's such a fascinating character in so many ways. That so many dichotomies and so many different interests. I mean, for example, he didn't call himself a Zen Buddhist, but he definitely practiced Zen. Zen is known for being very, you know, austere and you know, no gods and deities and all that. But he's also very comfortable with the Anasazi turning into a bird and flying away on a crow. I mean, he's just, you know, it's sort of like he's gathering the whole world here. He doesn't I don't know, he doesn't pigeonhole himself. No pun intended.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. Right.
He takes it all in.
Yeah, and you know, he has this sort of vision, you know, this experience where he's riding, you know, this crow, and in a moment that helps him escape unfortunate circumstances, right? The sort of troubles of his life, maybe depressions, which Jim suffered from very much throughout his life. And you know, there's this crow which has all sorts of, just loaded down with symbolism, right? And the crow, both of wisdom and transformation, but also death. And so it's interesting that it, you know, flirts with both sides of that equation, I think. And I think the poem does too.
And then he mentions the fact that he was a hunter of birds as well. Let's include that as well, right? The thousand birds and dogs help me shoot.
Such a strange moment too, right? The thousand birds the dog helped me shoot to become a bird. And I've puzzled over that.
He's eating the birds.
He's eating the birds.
Yeah, that's what I took from it.
I think you're right. I think you're right. I think it's the life and death experience. It's the food that he consumed of the birds, that it's the attentiveness and attention that he paid to these birds in coordination with his dogs that helped him learn more about birds. It's all those things I think that help him sort of in this transformation that he undergoes, right? During this vision, and then later potentially on his deathbed.
Yeah, I mean, just like any other poet, he's got a lot of humor. There's a lot of the natural world and birds and animals in his poems, but it all comes down to love and death. And now we transition to his deathbed, and this fascinating little moment of writing his secret number on a slip of paper.
Yeah, there's a lot of fascinating little details here that I've tried to puzzle out over the years. But the thunderstorms approach from the west, and then looking past our eyes and the dead fly on the window screen. I feel like it invokes the Anasazi sort of mythology that he's creating. The drought that potentially, at least people have theorized, helped drive the Anasazi out of their area at Four Corners, and that famous image of the coming of the rain, right, which was so important to the Anasazi, of course, living where they did, but also in Western history, Western literature and mythology, right, the Arthurian legends, the coming of the rains. And so there's this transference, right, between Jim's death and new life, both. I find maybe coming here in these images. Okay. The thunderstorms approach, the Anasazi famously sort of drew these really amazing images of rainbirds in a lot of their pottery. And so there's a merger here of like the rain and the birds coming together here in this, in this moment. And then you have this sort of fascinating image of a dead fly, which I think in one hand sort of recalls Emily Dickinson, right? I heard a fly buzz when I died on the one hand, but then you also have that like Leslie Marmon Silko ceremony mythology about the fly that helps to bring rain.
Okay, yeah.
Right?
But it's a dead fly.
But it's a dead fly. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, it's the cycle of life. I'm not quite sure what to do with the dead fly.
One of my favorite Harrison quotes, and it's in an essay. And do you know this volume, Beneath a Single Moon, a collection of Buddhist poetry?
I know the name. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not terribly familiar with it.
There's a chapter there of Jim's stuff, and I don't know where the essay came from, but that's where I got it. And he said something to the effect of a bird flying past the window frame is a reminder of the passing of time, but sometimes a bird flying past the window is just a bird flying past the window. and I kind of took this fly. I love what you're doing with it, but I just saw that as he's looking, it's detail. It's, it is a dead fly, which I think is significant, but he's looking past his wife and daughter's eyes in this image he has through the window. And by the way, there's a dead fly on the window screen out to the clouds. But yeah, interesting.
Yeah, it's funny in the complete poems, it's telling if you look at the preface to After IQ, which is just a page away from the end of this. So he has a line in here where he says, "We are more than dying flies in a shit house, though we are that too."
We are that too, yeah.
Which I think echoes. Is a nice, interesting echo with this image.
So if he were here with us, he might say that if we said, "What is this fly?" he might say it's a dead fly on the window screen. That's what it is.
Very well be just what it is, right?
But then this just beautiful ending, and how can you not hear not hear Whitman when you say, "I'll sing to myself"?
I think that's brilliant. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I also hear Dylan Thomas here.
Ah, okay.
Jim does go, seems to me he does go gentle into that good night, or hopes for that anyway.
Right.
Carry me now into that cloud, into the marvel of this final night. I hear a little Denton. There's a big influence on Jim too, but yeah, I think I see Whitman. I see, I see Whitman. I see Thomas. I see Dickinson in this poem. And I even see Proof Rock, right? T.S. Eliot's Proof Rock, measuring out my life in coffee spoons, right? Jim's, I wouldn't even say he's measuring it. He's accounting for, maybe he's measuring, he's accounting for his life, but for him, it's birds and experiences, right?
And maybe wine bottles.
And maybe wine bottles.
Yeah. That's an interesting comparison. I think just as a human being, there couldn't be two different people than T.S. Eliot and Jim Harrison, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think they're you like one of his influences, Charles Olson, who was like an anti, right, Eliot, right, literally.
By the way, I just wanted to mention something curious. I was I'm a songwriter, and the theme song that brings these episodes in and out is one of my old songs called "Girl in a Green Dress," and I just picked it not for any particular reason other than I like the sound of it as a kind of a sort of a little theme song. And I was poking around in the Essential earlier today, and I came across, this is crazy, man. I came across in the Returning to Earth selection, this line. Let's see. But others not less extraordinary who step lightly into the dream life, refusing to leave. Girl in a green dress, woman lolling in foot deep Caribbean. I'm sure I didn't get it from him, and I guess it's not that unusual, but very precise. Girl in a green dress.
Isn't that funny? Yeah.
I don't know.
Who knows where these things come from, right?
Yeah, no kidding. Todd, thank you so much for doing this. Can you would you do us a favor and read the poem? I'd love to hear it in your voice.
I'd love to. Thanks,
Great.
John. This has been a great experience. Counting Birds for Gerald Visner. As a child, fresh out of the hospital, with tape covering the left side of my face, I began to count birds. At age 50, the sum total is precise and astonishing, my only secret. Some men count women or the cars they've owned, their shirts, long-sleeved and short-sleeved, or shoes, but I have my birds. Excluding, of course, those extraordinary days, the 21,000 snow geese and sandhill cranes at Bosque dell'Apache, the sky blinded by great frigate birds in the Pacific off Unconcito, Ecuador, the 21,000 pink flamingos in the Ngorongoro crater in Tanzania, the vast flock of seabirds on the Siri coast of the Sea of Cortez down in Sonora that left at nightfall, then reappeared, resuming their exact positions at dawn. The 1,000 cliff swallows nesting in the sand cliffs of Pyramid Point, their small round burrows like eyes, really the souls of the Anasazi who flew here 1,000 years ago to wait the coming of the Manitou. And then there were the usual almost deadly birds of the soul, the crow with silver harness I rode one night as if she were a black feathered angel, the birds I became to escape unfortunate circumstances, how the skin ached as the feathers shot out toward light. The 1,000 birds the dogs helped me shoot to become a bird, grouse, woodcock, duck, dove, snipe, pheasant, prairie chicken, etc. On my deathbed, I'll write this secret number on a slip of paper and pass it to my wife and 2 daughters. It will be a hot evening in late June, and they might be glancing out the window at the thunderstorms approach from the west. Looking past their eyes in a dead fly on the window screen, I'll wonder if there's a bird waiting for me in the onrushing clouds. Oh, birds, I'll sing to myself, you've carried me along on this bloody voyage. Carry me now into that cloud, into the marvel of this final night.
Yeah, man. Jim Harrison.
Jim Harrison.
Absolutely adore him. We sure look forward to your biography that comes out, you said in November?
November 4th, yep.
Okay. Well, Todd Goddard, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, John. Really appreciate it.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.